Hi there. My channel and content, along with many other fantastic creators, is now on Means TV, the world's first anti-capitalist streaming service. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the video, and I even have a nice little discount for you to check out as a thank you for supporting my channel. Hey, did you know black people in the US are responsible for most of the crime in the US despite only being a small proportion of the population? Unbelievable, right? Well, yeah, actually, in this case, literally, it is not believable. This meme is built on a falsehood. The 13-50% haha so funny nonsense has been a staple of modern anti-black racism in the US, so let's break it down and see why it is nonsense. Known as the 13-50% meme, it's a statistic wielded by racists that claims that black Americans, who make up just 13% of the population, are responsible for 50% of violent crimes. This sounds damning, but only if you don't think about it for more than 5 seconds. The stat is pure bullshit. The truth regarding crime is far more complicated and interesting, and it's very important to firstly note that crime statistics in the US don't really reflect who commits crimes, but rather who gets policed, arrested, and ultimately targeted by a centuries-old oppressive system that has adapted to the shifting attitudes towards being an overtly racist ghoul. This meme originated from FBI crime reports, specifically the Uniform Crime Report and National Crime Victimization Survey. These reports focus on arrests and victim reports, not on the actual total of crimes committed. Arrest data reflects the decisions made by law enforcement, which are influenced by racial biases, of course, rather than serving as an accurate measure of who is actually committing crimes. But with very careful cherry-picking, racists who seek to uphold a certain level of oppression use this data out of context to make it appear that black communities are uniquely prone to violence, when in reality the number reflects the priorities and biases of a criminal justice system that has always disproportionately targeted black people. So let's dive into the truth.
In America, black people are treated very much as the Vietnamese people or any other colonized people, because we're brutalized. The police in our community occupy our area, our community, as a foreign troop occupies territory. And the police are there not to, in our community, not to promote our welfare or for our security and our safety, but they're there to contain us, to brutalize us and murder us, because they have their orders to do so.
In the United States, African Americans and their communities have always been treated with systematic surveillance, suspicion, and violence from the American state. Starting from slave patrols to keep slaves in line to Jim Crow laws and lynchings, simply existing in the US as a black person was a danger to one's safety and life. In the modern era, the streets of black neighborhoods are patrolled by military-style police, similar to occupied territories and war zones. Schools are much the same, run like prisons. Overpolicing has seeped into every corner of African American life, creating an atmosphere of fear coupled with invasive surveillance. This criminalization of black children starts in the classroom. Teachers and administrators view black children through a lens of racial stereotypes, treat them as suspects, and act like prison guards without these kids doing anything wrong. These biases lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Students who are labeled as troublemakers are treated as such, with some internalizing these expectations and acting accordingly, essentially being punished for things imposed on them. Legal scholar Jonathan Simon coined the term governing through crime to describe the way schools and social institutions treat children like criminals before they even commit a crime. The very structure of schools, from metal detectors to constant surveillance, mirrors the environment of incarceration itself.
I was standing outside for a long time and it's cold. I felt like I was in jail.
This turns schools into breeding grounds for future inmates precisely because minor offenses are treated like violence, which will use jail and prison as the remedy. So it should come as no surprise then that black children are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended and 3 times more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts. Neighborhoods face similar conditions. Black students grow up under the constant watch of police officers who are trained to fear them and treat them as threats. This unrelenting surveillance serves to reinforce the idea that black children are inherently dangerous. This reinforces the internalized sense of criminality projected onto them. The overlapping presence of police in both schools and communities creates an environment where black children are never free from the watchful eye of the state or its institutionalized violence. Crime statistics in the United States do not reflect who commits the most crimes, but rather who is most heavily policed and arrested. This cannot be overemphasized. Overpolicing in black communities drastically inflates crime statistics that are then, by a spectacular feat of circular reasoning, used to quote-unquote prove that African Americans are more prone to criminality. Black neighborhoods are subject to far more intense surveillance than white neighborhoods, which naturally leads to more arrests and prosecutions. This overpolicing is not a reflection of higher crime rates, but of the biases inherent in the criminal justice system, which consistently over-targets black populations. For example, in New York City, stop and frisk policies almost exclusively targeted black and Latino men, leading to wildly inflated arrest statistics despite the indisputable fact that they were no more likely to be engaged in so-called criminal behavior than whites. In fact, this cycle, where arrest statistics are used to justify the continuation of oppressive policies, fuels the perception that black communities are more dangerous, further embedding these biases into both public policy and societal views.
To end the drug menace and cripple organized crime.
The war on drugs provides one of the clearest examples of how overpolicing skews crime data. Despite using drugs at nearly identical rates, black Americans are far more likely to be arrested for drug-related offenses than white Americans. In 2019, for example, black Americans made up 26% of all drug arrests, even though they represent only 13% of the population. These arrest rates are driven by aggressive policing strategies in black neighborhoods, not by higher rates of drug use. These disparities in arrest rates feed the perception that black people are inherently more prone to criminality, while white drug use, which occurs at similar rates, largely goes unpunished. These statistics also reflect systemic inequalities in sentencing. The 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for crack versus powder cocaine is one of the clearest and starkest examples of how the criminal justice system punishes black Americans more severely than whites. This disparity basically ensures that black people would be far more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses than their white counterparts, even when engaging in the same criminal behavior. By focusing on minor, non-violent drug offenses in black communities, law enforcement agencies have created an inflated perception of criminality that further justifies the disproportionate incarceration of black people. Of course, implicit racial bias plays a major role in the overpolicing of black communities and the skewed nature of crime data. Implicit bias basically refers to the unconscious associations people make between blackness and criminality, which in turn shapes how police officers, judges, and juries treat black individuals. This bias is especially dangerous because it operates beneath the surface of consciousness, affecting how law enforcement officers interpret the action of African American suspects. Even when black individuals are minding their business, which is the vast majority of the time, not engaging in any criminal activity or behavior, their mere presence is often deemed suspicious, leading to stops, searches, and arrests that wouldn't have happened in white neighborhoods. Research is clear in that white people consistently overestimate the proportion of crimes committed by black people, which is horrifying on a societal level. Police officers are more likely to stop, search, and arrest black individuals even when there is no evidence of wrongdoing. This implicit bias plays a role in determining whether or not an officer chooses to use deadly force, too. Police officers are far more likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than white suspects. These biases extend beyond law enforcement and into the courtroom as well. Black defendants are more likely to be convicted than white defendants for the same crimes, and when convicted, they often receive harsher sentences. Black inmates are less likely to be granted parole than their white counterparts, even when their offenses and sentences are identical. This disparity extends to capital punishment cases as well, of course, because the problem is systemic. Black defendants are far more likely to be given a death sentence, especially if the victim is white, a continuation of slavery-era mindsets. These disparities cannot be explained by differences in criminal behavior. They are a direct result of systemic racism within the criminal justice system. Implicit bias ensures that at every level, from arrest to sentencing, black people face harsher treatment. Back to the classroom, remember when I said that black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school than white students for the same infractions? This disparity is even more pronounced for black students with disabilities, who are punished for behaviors related to their disabilities rather than receiving the support they need. These disparities are reflective of the broader criminalization of black children, which starts in schools and continues into adulthood. Black children are more likely to be perceived as older, more dangerous, and less innocent than their white peers, a phenomenon known as adultification bias. This bias leads to harsher punishments for black children in schools, where they are disciplined more severely than white children for the same behaviors, which is also foundational for the school-to-prison pipeline, where black students are punished en masse, funneled into the juvenile justice system, and eventually into the criminal justice system as adults. This perpetual surveillance in society reinforces the idea that black children are inherently dangerous, quote-unquote. Teachers and administrators, influenced by the same biases that affect law enforcement, often treat black students as potential criminals rather than students in need of guidance or support. Data not only shows that black children are more likely to be referred to law enforcement for minor disciplinary issues in schools, but also over 70% of them are arrested in school in front of their friends and teachers, which is a horrific way to reinforce this systemic view. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where black children internalize these labels, leading to higher dropout rates and increased interactions with the criminal justice system as they grow older. Once labeled as troublemakers or criminals, black children face a much higher likelihood of being funneled into the juvenile justice system and eventually the adult prison system. The school-to-prison pipeline is part of a broader overall goal. Mass incarceration of black people is mostly for the use of cheap labor. That is, they are punished with slavery. The mass incarceration of black Americans is one of the most devastating consequences of overpolicing and the school-to-prison pipeline. Today, nearly 20% of black men in their 30s have spent time in prison. For black boys who drop out of high school, that figure soars to 60%. This isn't because black Americans commit more crimes, it's because the system is designed to incarcerate them at disproportionately higher rates. Mass incarceration isn't just about the sheer number of black people in prison, it's about how the prison system profits off of their labor and keeps them from realizing a better future for themselves. In some parts of the US, incarcerated black men are forced to work in conditions that are eerily similar to slavery. Angola Prison in Louisiana, for example, still forces inmates, many of whom are serving life sentences for non-violent offenses, to pick cotton. Mass incarceration is not only a method of racial control, but also an economic engine that profits from the exploitation of black Americans' labor under the guise of punishment and rehabilitation. Incarceration also has wide-reaching consequences that extend beyond just the prison walls. Black Americans who are incarcerated face barriers to re-entering society at every level. Criminal records prevent them from finding employment, accessing housing, or participating in civic life, such as with voting. This system of punishment, combined with post-incarceration restrictions, keeps black Americans trapped in cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement, creating a revolving door where prison becomes an almost inevitable destination for those who have once entered the system. This is by design. Mass incarceration is not an accidental byproduct of the criminal justice system, it is a key feature. With prisons acting as economic engines, especially in rural communities, the demand for incarcerated individuals becomes a driving force for the expansion of punitive measures. By 2016, over $80 billion was being spent annually on corrections in the US, with much of this economic growth benefiting white rural areas that have room for large prisons while decimating the communities the inmates are taken from. This structural entanglement between incarceration and economic interests ensures that the system persists even as it devastates black communities. The relationship between poverty and crime should not go unsaid. It is well known to be a vicious feedback loop, and this is especially true for black Americans. Systemic racism in housing, employment, education, and public services has historically prevented black Americans from accumulating wealth and escaping poverty. This has resulted in concentrated areas of poverty, often in inner city neighborhoods, where economic opportunities are scarce and crime becomes a byproduct of these conditions. African Americans are systematically discriminated against in housing opportunities, employment, pay, loans, education, and so much more. Policies like redlining and racially restrictive covenants segregated black people into specific areas, limiting their access to wealth-building opportunities like home ownership. As a result, black neighborhoods were starved of economic investment and became hubs of poverty and neglect. Without significant job opportunities, many residents in these communities turned to informal economies or criminal activities, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Poverty is criminalized and black people are overpoliced in these neglected communities, reinforcing the cycle of poverty and crime. Data shows that overpolicing in these impoverished areas fuels the cycle of poverty by further stigmatizing those arrested, limiting their ability to realize their full potential, or any potential for that matter. After being incarcerated, black Americans face even more significant barriers to economic stability. Those who serve time in prison often struggle to find employment or housing, as criminal background checks disqualify them from many opportunities. Even after serving their time, formerly incarcerated black individuals continue to be punished by a system that denies them access to the tools necessary to break free from poverty. Former inmates face an unemployment rate of nearly 27%, making it exceedingly difficult to reintegrate into society and avoid returning to prison. Discriminatory housing practices like redlining have become instrumental in creating the ghettos and impoverished areas we see today. These neighborhoods, which are deprived of basic services and are overpoliced, leads to higher crime statistics, further entrenching the idea that black people are inherently more criminal, which is nonsense. The economic deprivation in these areas has been used as a justification for increasing police presence rather than addressing the root cause of crime. Stuff like poverty, lack of education, and a lack of economic opportunity. For Black Americans, the deck is stacked at every level. They are systematically discouraged from building wealth and escaping poverty, and when they engage in behaviors tied to economic deprivation, they are criminalized. The prison system, rather than being a means to rehabilitate or reform, becomes a revolving door that keeps Black Americans trapped in poverty and prison. This cycle perpetuates itself. Poverty leads to crime, which leads to more policing and imprisonment, which leads to more poverty, and so on. This vicious cycle ensures that the socioeconomic conditions that contribute to crime in Black communities remain unaddressed, while police and prisons are continually funded and overfunded. Overpolicing, poverty, mass incarceration are deeply entrenched tools of oppression in the US, but it sounds rather familiar. I wonder where we've seen similar things. Oh, I remember. There's a rather famous system of racial control similar to what I've described. The treatment of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. The overpolicing, mass incarceration, and systemic racism experienced by Black Americans have striking parallels with the treatments of Palestinians under Israeli military occupation. Both Black Americans and Palestinians are subject to surveillance, aggressive policing, and criminalization from an early age. For Palestinians, much like Black Americans, this process of criminalization begins in childhood. Israeli forces frequently arrest Palestinian children, sometimes as young as 10 years old, for alleged minor infractions. These children are often detained in military prisons, tried in military courts, and subjected to inhumane treatment, similar to how Black children in the US are funneled into the juvenile justice system and later into the adult prison system. It generally boggles the mind how similar these systems are. Both Black Americans and Palestinians live under constant surveillance, are treated as dangerous threats simply because of their racial or ethnic identity. In both cases, the state justifies its repressive policies by framing these populations as inherently violent, criminal, and in need of strict control. The methods used to control these populations, aggressive policing, mass incarceration, and surveillance, serve to dehumanize them and maintain the status quo of oppression. The cherry on top, US police are trained by Israel in the same techniques they use against the indigenous population of Palestine.
In World War II, this country could use its news media to propagandize and make the whole American public love the Russians and the Chinese and hate the Germans and the Japanese. And then after the war, they changed it and made the American public love the Germans and love the Japanese, hate the Russians and hate the Chinese, which shows that they can make the American public love whom they will and hate whom they will.
In the US, local newscasts tend to tell the same story. Black faces equal crime stories. The same tired narrative. Black people, but Black men in particular, are the face of crime plastered all over screens, while
white
criminals remain conveniently hidden or downplayed. And if you, like a lot of Americans, only get your information from these newscasts, you'd also believe a racist narrative that portrays Black people as criminals to the point of caricature. Even when it comes to showing potential offenders, Black men are shown with a mugshot, white men, on the other hand, are shown with cutesy family photos. But the real numbers don't lie and tell a vastly different story. 2/3 of street crime arrests are of white people, which makes sense because white people are most of the population. But you wouldn't know that from the way the US media reports on crime. It's not just that Black crime is overrepresented, the concept and image of Blackness have been fused with the idea of criminality. One can limply try to claim that it's some kind of accident, even a harmful accident born of implicit bias, and while that is possible, there's nothing neutral about this. It is deliberate. Black men are turned into villains day after day, and it's impossible to separate these images from the way they end up being perceived. This is a process that begins with the genocide of Native Americans and continues to this day, turning the other into an internal enemy to always distract you from the real central issue of the United States and everywhere else: the principal contradiction: class. What you see on the screen isn't a reflection of reality, it's a carefully curated image designed to keep white audiences feeling safe and superior so they don't question why real wages are stagnant, yet corporations run their country and their bosses own several yachts. This becomes even more glaring when you look at how the media portrays white crime, when it does decide to report on it. White people are almost exclusively portrayed as white-collar criminals, and the effects of white-collar crime are significant, but they don't imply that. White-collar crime siphons off between $300 and $600 billion annually through corporate fraud, embezzlement, and healthcare scams. These crimes destroy lives, bankrupt families, and destabilize entire communities, yet the perpetrators, white, wealthy, and powerful usually, are rarely held accountable and therefore operate in plain sight. The best and most recent example is the destructive power of the 2008 financial crash and the media's fixation on black street crime instead, which helped distract everyone from the fact that the very powerful people responsible for the crash faced absolutely no consequences. In fact, in some ways, they were rewarded for it. So yes, it turns out that the 1350% meme is a bullshit statistic completely without foundation. That hasn't stopped those in power from using it as a weapon wielded to uphold white supremacy and make it a crime to simply be black. This power play, or deliberate distortion, whatever you want to call it, is used to justify overpolicing and mass incarceration with all the intensity of an invading army. This underclass has shown brilliant resilience over the centuries, as demonstrated by the fact that people from dozens of tribes and backgrounds brought together under violent and obscene circumstances created a culture in opposition to their oppressors that continues to sustain them to this day. I can only hope that one day they see true emancipation from this oppression, as do their brothers and sisters in Palestine hope for their own as well as for that of the African American community. If you're interested in further reading, then read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander for a deeper dive. Back to our exciting announcement. You can now find my content on Means TV. If you're not familiar with Means TV, they're an explicitly anti-capitalist worker-owned cooperative that produces worker-owned educational and entertainment content in a streaming service format. You can find everything from my videos to original series like Means Morning News to feature-length documentaries like Abby Martin's Gaza Fights for Freedom, with more amazing content being added every day. As you all know, leftist creators have to be incredibly careful to avoid the various forms of censorship that, for some reason, don't affect the right. I wonder why. Regardless, my uncensored videos and more edgy content can comfortably be viewed on Means TV without all the tricks and clever self-censorship needed. A platform that allows us to say what we want to say and make what we really want to make. We can even chat and discuss on a community forum where creators can engage with each other and their viewers right on the platform. The main reason I and many others joined, however, is that Means TV is ideologically dedicated to supporting principled socialist content. As a little thank you for watching my channel, if you sign up with my link below, you can get your first month 20% off. That's only $7.99 a month. Or for an even better deal, you can opt for the annual plan and get 20% off the whole year. Every person who signs up using my link is directly contributing to the financial stability of my channel and the entire cooperative media project. Had it not been for you guys and your support, my channel, the Deprogram, and Means TV wouldn't be possible. So if you'd like to help support my work and that of many other fantastic creators, consider signing up for Means TV using my link below. Thanks for watching. This video wouldn't have been possible without my patrons, whom I'm very thankful for. With my anti-capital stance and pro-Palestine positions, it's getting more and more difficult getting sponsors so that I can pay my editor fairly, so your support is what keeps all of this possible. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.